Hi there! In previous videos on this channel, I have created this ChatWTF ChatGPT clone project in PHP. But so far I've only been playing around with this locally on my own computer. But now I would like to deploy this on the internet. But before I can do that, there are some issues I have to resolve. Because, like I mentioned, I've only been playing around with this locally, so I haven't really been paying attention to security and stuff. So let's fix the security issues in this project in today's video. Now, what are the issues? Well, first of all, the directory structure. Currently, we have the index.php file in the root of the project, along with all these other routes that we have here. So the create title, delete chat, message.php, and text to audio.php. And this means that all the other files and directories would also be accessible publicly if we just upload this code to a server. Now, most of these files don't actually do anything if you would directly access them, so in that sense it doesn't matter. But I think it's still good practice to separate these things out. Especially because we have a directory called db in which we actually have the database if you're using SQLite. So if you would just upload this code on a server, anyone could download the whole database if you put it in this directory. So to mitigate this issue, let's create a public directory. And let's put all the files that should be accessible publicly into this directory. So first of all, we have assets, which has CSS and JavaScript. So these, of course, are public. So let's move them into public. And then we have the create title endpoint, the delete chat, and the index and message and text to audio. So let's move all of these to public as well. And this, of course, means that now we have to run the web server from public, not from the root of the project, which is a bit annoying on some hosting providers, but I think it's worth it for the security. Now, in this case, when I'm running it locally, I'm running it with PHP-S localhost 8080, then we have to add the T flag here and say public. So the T flag basically tells it where to have the document root. So now everything is running from the public directory. Now, of course, this is not going to work. If I refresh, we get an error because all the references to these files are now wrong. So let's see. In index, we are trying to find settings, but we can't find it. So let's fix this. We have to do, instead of dir/settings, we have to do dir/../settings to get it from the parent directory. And let's do the same thing for the database and the autoload. And let's do it for all of these routes. So here we have to have settings, database autoload, and here we have to do the same things. And in message, we also have all these same things. And in text to audio, we have the settings as well. Now, in text to audio, we have other issues. First of all, we are using this speech directory, again from dir, but this is now not in public, and I don't want to put it in the public. Because basically what this endpoint does is it takes in some text and it converts it into audio with 11 labs, and then it returns the file name for the audio. And this is, of course, used in our speech mode. So if we go back here now, it should work. And if we select from here our speech mode and we say hello, then it should actually respond with speech. But of course, it doesn't work right now. And the reason is, like I said, we return from here the base name of the output file. And then in our JavaScript, we are trying to play the audio. If we go to new audio, then here we're trying to set the source of the audio to speech/output/the name of the file. But this is not really a good idea because then everybody's output will be accessible publicly. So what we could do instead is we could go here and not respond with the name of the file, but the actual audio from the file. So we could do something like this. We could return base64 encode file get contents output file. And that means we can delete this file right away. So let's actually put this in a variable called b64 audio, and then we can just delete the file after this. So unlink output file. And in fact, it is kind of stupid how I made this originally. So we create in this speech directory an input directory and an output directory. And we put the input text into a file in the input directory, and then it creates a file in the output directory. But what we could do instead is we could get rid of all this stuff and all this cleaning up of old output files. We don't need to do that. We just take the text, and we don't need to create the input directory or the output directory. And we don't need to create this stupid ID here. And what we can do instead here is set the input file to a temporary file in the file system of the server. So we can just say temp name, and we can get the directory from sys get temp dir. Then we have to set some prefix here. Let's do CWTF text, and let's do the same thing for the output file. And this can be like audio, like this. And then we write it normally, the text into the input file. And then we run this generate.py, which is just a script we have here, generate.py, which takes in the input file, reads the text in it, and then generates the audio and saves it into the output file. So then this should work just fine, although I deleted the speech directory from here. So this should now be in dir / speech / generate. That is the location of this generate.py. And we delete the input file after the script, and we delete the output file, and we return the base64 audio. So then what we can do in our script is, instead of using a real URI, we can just do a data URI. So we can say data audio /mpeg semicolon base64, comma, and then put the base64 encoded audio here. So that should work. And that means we can also delete from speech or input and output directories. We don't need these things anymore. But let's see if it works. So if we refresh and we take speech and we say hello, then
hello, how can I assist you today?
We get a response. Amazing. It works. Now, the next issue we're going to have is with the CodeInterpreter mode, which we in fact have here. Now, this one doesn't use the ChatGPT API's CodeInterpreter mode. This actually runs the code on my computer, in fact, in a Docker container. Now, this should still work just fine if I say something like sort these names according to the length of the name. Jack, Michael, Abraham, Lee. If I do this, then it suggests that it would like to run this kind of code. If we run the code, then we get the answer from the code, and then it responds based on the code result. Okay, that's fine. But this can also write to files. So we can do something like make a chart of the names and their lengths. Then this one will probably fail. Let's see. It wants to run this kind of code. Okay, let's run it. And it got some responses from the code. And it tries to provide us with the chart with a link and an image, but this doesn't work. And the reason is that it tries to get it from data/3, which is the chat ID, /data /names length chart. Now, I think we have this file here. If we go to our data now, we have it here. So this is the chart it created. But because this is no longer in the public directory, we can't access it. Now, I don't want to put it in the public directory, because when I publish this, then everybody's data files would be accessible to anybody. And especially because we are using numbers as the chat IDs, then this is not really good, because you could just easily guess a number. Furthermore, we don't have a user authentication system or a login system right now, so we can't even check if the user has access to the file. So I think what we should do at first is change from using a number as the ID to using a UUID, because that is a lot harder to guess. And then we can make an endpoint in our public directory that takes in the chat ID and the file you want to read, and then it can check whether the user has access to that file and then show it if they have access. Of course, now everybody will have access because we don't have users. But considering the future. So let's do that. How are we going to do that? Let's find everywhere where we use chat ID, and let's convert it into a string. So first of all, in create title, we take the chat ID and we convert it into an int val. So we can't do this anymore. So let's remove this. And in delete chat, we also do int val. So let's remove int val from here. And in index, we also do the same thing. And then even if it's not defined, we make it 0. But let's make it something like null right now. And of course, we can't pass null into conversation class find. And it's of course kind of stupid to try to find the chat every time, even if you don't provide it. So let's do this. If we have a chat ID, then we try to do this. We try to find it from the database. And if we can't find it, then let's just set it to null. And do we use chat ID here somewhere else? Here we give the chat ID to JavaScript. And again, we use int val here. So let's remove this and put it into quotes. Now this is kind of dangerous because this comes directly from the user. So let's at least do something like HTML special chars so that we don't get XSS attacked. And what else do we have here? We just check if we have the chat ID. We do the same thing here, and that's it. So what's next? In message.php, again, we do int val. So let's remove this. And in message.php, we should in fact always have this. So we should check for it, but let's skip this for now. And do we have other places here? I think that's fine. In script, we actually define it as a string, so that shouldn't matter. And all these other places, we just use the chat ID as it is. So that should be just fine. Okay, next we have the UI script. Here we just pass it in from the data ID, that's fine. And in our ChatGPT class, we don't actually care about this chat ID because this is part of the ChatGPT library I have created. So it is unrelated, so we don't have to worry about that. But in CodeInterpreter, we pass in the int chat ID. So actually we want to pass in a string chat ID. But now we get into a little bit of a dangerous territory because we are constructing a path from the chat ID. So we should do some sort of sanitization here. Let's do something like chat ID equals preg replace, and let's replace everything that is not A to Z or 0 to 9 or a dash. Replace all of those with nothing in chat ID. So I think that should be pretty safe. Because if we don't do this, then someone could pass in like a ... chat ID and then do some damage. So let's do that. Do we use it somewhere else? No, that's it. Then in our conversation interface, we are defining the find function as taking an integer of the chat ID. So let's use a string instead. And what else? That should be fine. How about in our save? In our save function, we return an int, which actually should be a string because it returns the ID of the chat that was created. And then in our session conversation, and by the way, if you haven't been watching this series, we have basically a session conversation and an SQL conversation. So we can either save the conversations in the PHP session or in an actual SQL database. Right now I'm using the sessions. And here we have chat ID, which is an integer. So this should be a string. And what else? When we find, we need to pass in a string, not an int. And those should be fine. That should be fine. This should be fine. That's okay. But here, the save function returns a string. And when we add a new chat, here we are making the chat ID with count chats plus 1. But now we have to create a UUID here. How do we create a UUID? Let's ask ChatWTF. Does this still work? If I now go here, it still seems to work. So let's ask it, how do I create a UUID in PHP? You can create a UUID with the Ramsey UUID library. Okay, now I don't really want to pull in an external library for this project. So let's see. Can I do it without an external library? Yes, you can do it this way. Okay, so what is going on here? We use sprintf with a massive format string, and then we pass in basically a bunch of random numbers. And we do something with some of these numbers. I guess that will make it like compatible with UUID. Okay, let's trust ChatGPT that this works, and let's copy this. And let's create like a UUID class. So then we can call like UUID new. So let's do that. Let's go to our source and create a new file, uuid.php, and this will be a class UUID. And let's just add here a public static function new, and it will return a string, and basically it does this. So we just return that stuff. Now, I think you actually need the external library if you want to be like completely compliant with the UUID standard, but I don't really care. I think it is enough to just create a random string that looks like a UUID. So this is good enough for me. So let's go to session conversation, and we create the chat ID with UUID new. We save it there, and is there any other places where we use it? No, that's it. Let's go to the next search result, which is in SQL conversation. And basically we have to do the same thing here. So this is a string, and when we get the chats, we select the ID, title, mode, model from conversations, and we order by ID. Now this is an issue because UUIDs, of course, are not orderable like in time. They're not sequential. So we have to probably add some sort of created time column here. So let's do order by created time. And what else? When we find by the string of chat ID, and when we get the messages, we reference the conversation in the messages table with the chat ID. So we have to update two different places because we have two tables here. We have conversations and messages. So what else? When we add a new message, we just save the conversation there with the chat ID. That's fine. And what else? When we save a new conversation, we need to return the string of the ID of the conversation. And right now, because we are using the auto increment, we are not even setting the ID here. But now we have to set it. So we have to say ID, and here as well, ID, and we just basically create a new ID. So the ID is going to be UUID new. Now we also set this chat ID to the last insert ID. I'm not sure if the last insert ID will work. Let's see if it works. I think it will work because we are going to still set the ID in the table as a primary key. So that should work. And when we update, we just update based on that ID. And we delete based on the ID. Okay, what else? That's all. Now we have to update the SQL database. Let's go here and let's go to conversations. And instead of an integer, we need to have a string. So let's change this thing. And for now, I will set it to varchar. And I think the length should be 36 characters for a UUID. Now, varchar type is not going to be the most performant. I think you are supposed to save it in some special format. But just to make it support the old IDs, I will now use varchar because I can convert an integer easily into a varchar. So we can do like this. And of course, this is not an auto increment anymore. So yeah, that should work. Let me preview this so I can copy this SQL so that I can make a migration later. But now it's a varchar 36. So let me save this somewhere in here. And let's do the same thing with messages. And yes, we have to add the column here called created time. And this will just be a date time. Where's my date time? Here. And I am going to set it as null by default because I already have some items in the database. So I need to be able to set it to null so that I can actually still keep them in there. So let's copy this and save it, and let's add it here. Now, the thing is that in our SQL conversation, when we sort the chats, we're going to have a bunch of nulls now in the created time. So maybe we would add here also ID desk. So then the items that in conversation have a regular ID and created time is null, then those will be sorted properly as well. And let's also change in our messages the conversation column from int into a varchar 36. So it's varchar 36. And that should be all. Let's preview this so I can copy this alter code and let's save it. So now it is 36 as well. So let's save this thing here as well. And now it should work really. Let's try. Let's refresh. It's still working. if I go to this conversation, it's still here. If I go to that one, that's still there. If I go to this one, it's still there. And if I create a new chat and I say hello, it responds, it creates a new title. And if I go to new chat and I go back here, then now we have a UUID. But see, these old ones still work. They just have the numeric ID right now. So that's pretty cool. Now we should switch to the SQL mode. So let's go to our settings and let's change the storage type from session to SQL. And let's go to new chat. So now we are getting these from the database. And we can still browse these and they are numeric IDs. But if I go to new chat and I say hello, then it works. We get a title or no. Title creation does not work for some reason. Let's see why. Unable to create title. Well, that is a very helpful error. So let's go to create title. And what can go wrong here? If we can't find the conversation by the chat ID, then we give this error, basically. So what's going on here? Let's refresh. And we have two untitled chats here. What are these? These are empty. Okay, so in our messages, if we sort these by ID descending, we have conversation zeros. So what I presume happened is that somewhere we are saying int val, or somewhere we have an int type for the chat ID. Can I do chat ID like this? No, we don't have that. So let's go to our SQL conversation. And when we save this, we insert into conversations the ID. We get the chat ID. Maybe this one doesn't work. The last insert ID. No, it's not this. It is in add message. Where's our add message? Here we give the message and here we say this chat ID. Okay. So I think it might in fact be because of this. So the last insert ID doesn't work. Let's say that the chat ID is the UUID new. And then we just put the chat ID here. So then it's already saved as the current chat ID. So does that work? Let's try. The new chat, let's say hello. We get the response and we get a title. And if we now go to new chat, then now we have it here and it works. Okay, so that was the issue. We can't use last insert ID, apparently, if we are using the UUID in there. Anyway, now it works. So what we can do with this is we can now create an endpoint that will take the chat ID and the file we want to fetch, and then it will find it in the data directory and then show it. Let's make first sure that we are actually still writing in the data directory. So if I make a new chat and I say CodeInterpreter and I ask it to create a sine wave plot. So then it should want to run some code. And if I run the code, then here is the plot. Of course, it doesn't work. So let's check in data. We in fact have a new directory and here we have the sine wave plot. So that works. So the only thing that doesn't work is the link here. So this one goes here. So what we're going to do is we are going to add a new file here called data.php. And in this one, we should first of all copy all of these settings and database and autoload into this one. Although we might not need the database. So let's remove this. And we even might not need the settings, just the autoload. Let's see if we even need that one. But basically what we want to do here is we want to get the chat ID. So let's say if we do not have the chat ID, then we're going to give an error. So HTTP response code will be 400. And let's just die, you didn't provide a chat ID. And let's do the same thing with the file. So we also want to know what file you want to read. And then based on the chat ID, we should get the directory. So this one. So the chat dir is going to be the current directory we are in right now, which is public, slash, dot, dot, slash, data, slash, and then the chat ID. Now, we can't pass this in here directly because it is user given data. So let's first of all do like this. Chat ID is get chat ID. And down here, let's say that the file is get file. So the reason why we can't just pass it directly here is that someone might add a chat ID like dot dot slash settings.php and then they would like read this file. Or they can set the chat ID as ... and then they can say file is settings.php and then read our settings. Now, since we know that the chat ID is going to be a UUID, then we could again do that preg replace thing. Let's find the preg replace, and we might want to even move this into a method of the UUID class. So we can say something like UUID sanitize and then pass in the chat ID here. And then in UUID, we can have a public static function sanitize that takes the string of the UUID and returns a string, and it just returns this with the UUID. So then we can go to our data and we can say the chat ID is in fact UUID sanitize get chat ID. So then this one should be safe. And what we can do here is we can say real path, which will convert this path into one that doesn't have these ... slashes in it. And it might return false if this path doesn't exist. So we can say if not chat dir, then we can do http response code 404. And we can just die file not found. Now, we might say that the chat ID is not found, but that's kind of too much information. In case someone is trying to guess a chat ID, then they can just try whatever file from a given chat ID and it will tell them if the chat ID exists. But now they have to actually find the file. And then we can do that the file path is going to be chat dir slash the file. Now again, this one is dangerous, but if we do real path here, then it will convert this into the actual path. And what we can do then is first of all check that if that file doesn't exist, we say file not found. Again, we're not giving any more information than necessary. We're just saying file not found. So if file path doesn't exist. And then the most important thing we do is we check that the file path is inside of the chat directory. So if strpos in file path, the position of chat dir, if it is not exactly 0, so if the file path doesn't start with the chat directory and a slash, then this file is somewhere else other than the data directory. So again, we say file not found and nothing else. But after this, we can happily show the user this file. Of course, at this point, we would then check if the user has access to the given chat ID. Or actually, we can do that up here already when we have a user, but we don't have a user right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a header with content type, and the content type will be MIME content type of the file path. So whatever the file is. And then we're just going to read the file, which is file name. So that should pretty much work. Let's see if it works. So if we change this URL to be data.php, chat ID is this, and file is data/sine-wave-plot, and we go here, file is not found. So what is the issue here? Let's see, let's add some numbers here just for debugging so we know what the error is. Let's refresh. So file not found 3. So in fact, I did this the opposite way. This should be if it is not 0. So now it's going to work. If I now refresh, then we get an error 500. What is that error? I used file name here. It should be file path. So one more time, and here is our sine wave plot. So now the last thing we need to do is we need to fix it here, because this still doesn't work because it will link to this in the wrong way. It's still linked this way, but we need to link it this way. And this we can do in our script. Let's go to script and let's find sandbox. So I have this function here called convert links. And this is used with the text that is the response from ChatGPT. And it will basically convert all these kind of links into a different format. So ChatGPT will automatically add links to the data files either as data slash something, or sandbox : data slash, or sandbox mount data slash, or sandbox data slash. And currently we are converting these kind of links into this kind of links. But now what we have to do instead is we have to go to data.php and say chat ID is the chat ID, and then we have to say file equals data. And there should be an ampersand here as well. So now, if we go here and we refresh, look at this. We have the sine wave plot here. So now it works. And if we click the link, that works as well. And we no longer can directly access everything that is in the data directory. Although we kind of can, but we have more control over it. So in the future, we can add a login system, and then we can check in our data.php if the logged in person has access to the files of this chat ID. Great. But let's now try one more time that this thing works. So if I just say hello, it will respond with, hello, how can I assist you? If I ask something like, how can I make a UUID in Python? Then it should respond with this code, which is clearly a lot easier than PHP. Anyway, it works. If I go and select my speech mode and I say, tell me a joke, then it should tell me a joke.
Why couldn't the bicycle stand up by itself? Because it was too tired.
Great. So now we have speech. And finally, if we do CodeInterpreter and we say, create a chart of the number of days in each month of the year, then it wants to run this kind of code. And if we run it, then it creates this chart, which is completely useless, but it's just a way of testing this out. Great. It works. If you spotted any security vulnerabilities in my code, then let me know in the comments and I will fix them. And in the meantime, you can check out ChatWTF.com if you want to test this out. Now, there is one thing I have to do before I publish it, and that is I have to add to the UI a way to add your own API key. Because currently, this uses my OpenAI API key, and I don't want to give everybody free access to ChatGPT with my API key. I'm not that generous. So I have to implement that before I deploy this. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, then make sure to subscribe so you see more videos like this in the future. And leave me a comment and a like, and I will see you in the next one.